I'm finally making a video about the ship designer. I've kind of procrastinated on this one because it's a little intimidating of a topic to cover. I want to focus on the foundational knowledge, like understanding what each of these different numbers actually mean so that you're able to build your own designs. So let's start simple at the beginning of the game when you have no technology researched and go through stuff, and then I will do the console command to research everything and talk about a more full perspective. To start out with, there are different classes. Right now we only have corvettes and defense platforms. Defense platforms work a bit differently. You build these on starbases. They're static, they don't move around. So the only actual proper ship class that we have right now is corvette. By default, you have this auto-generate designs option ticked. This will create designs for you whenever you research new technologies. The problem with auto-generated designs is it pretty much just decides things based off of whatever's the highest tech. It's just looking for, oh, it has this big damage number, it must be good. And there's a lot more considerations to ship designs than just raw damage output. For example, if we look at these mass drivers here, this deals additional damage to shields, but less damage to armor. If you happen to be fighting an enemy that is using only armor and has no shields, then you're kind of wasting the potential of these weapons. So let's create a new corvette design. This brings up the ship role selection menu. This basically gives you a tiny bit more control over the ship auto design. Say we want a really long range ship, we can build artillery. You can also change it from up here. So what if we want a screen ship? This can maybe be a good way of understanding kind of different types of ships you might want to build. I'm going to pick custom so that we can have a blank slate. So the first choice is your ship section. This determines what weapon slots you have. On the Corvette, we only have a single section. However, bigger ships, like say this defense platform, have multiple sections. So maybe we have a bunch of small slots on the left section, and we get a large weapon slot on the right section. So going back to our Corvette design, I'm going to go ahead and select the picket ship. Before we pick any components, let's go through all of these stats over here. To start out with, there is the build time. That's how many days it takes to build the ship. Then the monthly upkeep of the ship and the cost to build it. Every component that you add adds cost and upkeep to the ship. Then in the ship stats, there is ship size. Some weapons deal more damage to bigger ships. This also determines how much command limit it uses from your fleets. This is basically a limit on how many ships an admiral can command. And then there's naval capacity usage. Most of the time this is the same as the ship size, though there are some exceptions like with biological ships. Then there's ship power. If you have a negative power, you will not be able to save your design. Having excess power gives you a couple of bonuses. For example, it gives us an extra 6% evasion. It gives us 6% speed. And also some extra damage. Different components of your ship use power. So power can sometimes limit you on which components you can use. You can increase your power by upgrading your fusion reactor or by adding a reactor booster to one of your auxiliary component slots. Next, there's hull points, armor, and shields. Shields are your first line of defense, and unless the weapon is able to penetrate the shields, then you have to deplete the shields before you can deal damage to the armor. Armor works the same way. Unless your weapon is able to penetrate the armor, then you have to deplete the armor hit points before you can deal damage to the hull. And if you take damage to your hull points, it reduces your ship fire rate. So your ship will deal less damage as it takes more hull damage. And then once this gets low enough, your ship will attempt to flee the battle, or if it gets fully depleted, it will be destroyed. If a ship successfully flees the battle, then it will come back once it is over. Then there's evasion. This is basically a chance to dodge different attacks. Smaller ships typically have more, whereas bigger ships have less. Something like a station has none since it can't move. Then there's speed. This is how fast the ship moves in sublight. The speed of your fleet is determined by the slowest ship in the fleet. However, once a fleet engages in a battle, each ship uses its own speed independently. So say, for example, if you have a fleet with a bunch of small corvettes, which are really fast, and then they are with a bigger, say, battleship or something that's really slow, the corvettes, once they engage in battle, can zoom forward at full speed and close the distance with the enemy faster. That's particularly important if you have shorter range weapons so that you can get into range quicker. Then there's the average damage of the ship per day. The actual damage that you do is determined by a bunch of different calculations on each individual weapon, so this is just an estimate. Then there's sensor range. This allows you to see into neighboring stars. It can be very valuable to be able to get information on, say, where the enemy fleets actually are. And finally, there is cloaking strength, which I will not be talking about in this video. I already made one about that if you'd like more information on this. So that's all of the stats on this window. Let's look at some of these individual components. So let's start down here with our utility components. There are several small defensive slots. If you click on one of these slots, you can add a component to it. You kind of click on it and then click where you'd like to add the component to. You can also fill all empty slots. So say, for example, I want 1 armor and then 2 shields. Instead of clicking twice with the shield, you could also go down here to fill empty. Some of the differences between armor and shield beyond what we've already talked about is that shields use power, whereas armor does not. Armor also has a higher upkeep cost than shields do. One of the biggest differences between the two is that shields naturally regenerate, whereas armor and hull typically don't regenerate, though it can under certain conditions. So you need to station them at a friendly starbase in order to get them to repair. If your fleets are damaged, you can click this repair fleet option and they will go to the nearest starbase, and then they will over time repair their damage. So a big advantage of shields is that typically in every battle you're going to be starting it with full shields, whereas armor is going to get worn down by successive battles. And shields also regenerate mid-battle as well. So for example, if we're in a battle and we get shot for 5 damage, over time we're replenishing that damage, and we're now back up to full health. So shields can be quite good against a small steady stream of damage since they're able to replenish the damage that they take over time. If you hit them super hard with a ton of stuff, then they'll be depleted and you can start dealing damage to the more vulnerable parts of the ship. Over the course of a full battle, your shields might end up absorbing more than their maximum capacity worth of damage. So say, for example, we only have 300 shields on this ship, but over the course of this battle, we've taken 717 damage to our shields. Next, let's look at the weapons. There are different categories of weapons. There are energy weapons, there are explosive weapons, and there are kinetic weapons. Energy weapons tend to be good against armor and hull, but not as good against shields. Kinetic weapons tend to be better against shields, but not as good against armor. And explosive weapons have shield penetration, which means that they just outright ignore shields and start dealing damage to the armor right away. So let's look at all of these different weapon stats. To start out, we have damage, that's self-explanatory. Then there is the cooldown, which is how many days it needs to wait until it can fire again. There is the accuracy, which is the chance it will hit, assuming that the ship it is targeting has no evasion. And then tracking basically negates evasion. This weapon has 25% tracking. So if we're shooting at a ship with, say, 30% evasion, then it will be like that ship only had 5 evasion. Typically, smaller weapons have more tracking. For example, the large red laser has only 5%, but the small red laser has 50%. So the way to think about it is smaller weapons are better at targeting smaller ships. Bigger weapons are going to have a harder time hitting smaller ships, but they do more damage, so they're good against bigger targets. Then the next stat is range. The first number is the minimum range and the second number is the maximum range. If we look at something like the large mass driver, it has a minimum range of 45, so it will not be able to shoot at ships closer to it than that. If you're able to get your ship up right in front of its face really close, this can lead to those weapons basically not being able to deal any damage at all. So it's really important to make sure that your ships are actually within their ideal range and are able to keep firing their weapons. And then of course with maximum range, if you're able to outrange your enemy, you can fire at them before they can shoot at you. Maybe you can get a couple of free shots off, maybe destroy one of their ships before they're able to deal any damage to you. Or once a battle is already underway, you can sit in the back, fire at them with your long-range weapons while they can't fire back at you because you outrange them. Then there's the average damage of the weapon, which takes into account the damage compared to the cooldown. Then there's also what the weapon targets. So for example, this targets enemies. There's a few rare exceptions where you actually target your ally with a more like support weapon. And then there's the weapon, whether it targets just a single ship or several different things at once. Most weapons are single target. And then this weapon has an indented section, missile, and you can see it has a hull points, armor, evasion, speed, and retargeting. So if a weapon has this section on it, like it says that it has a hull points, that means that the weapon actually fires through the map and can be intercepted. It can be shot down. Weapons that don't have anything like this means that they just, if they hit, they apply their damage right away. There is no interception. So there's the hull points of the missile, the armor of the missile, the evasion, all of those work the same as they do on regular ships. Retargeting range is basically the ability of the missile to choose a new target. Say it was initially fired at one ship, but that ship gets destroyed before it manages to hit. So then it can pick something else to hit. So how do you actually shoot down a missile? You can use, if we say pick the picket ship, there's point defense weapons. And these weapons specifically target projectiles like missiles and strike craft. So there's two different options here. There is sentinel point defense, and then there is flak batteries. The main difference is that sentinel point defense has a minus 75% shield damage, but it has plus 25% armor penetration and plus 100% armor damage. Whereas flak batteries have plus 25% shield penetration and plus 100% shield damage, but minus 75% armor damage. If we look at this missile, we can see it has no shields, it just has a hole in armor. So your point defense is in most situations for dealing with missiles. Strike craft, instead of having armor, they have shields. So flak is typically better against most strike craft. However, there are some strike craft that has armor instead. At the start of the game, the only way to get strike craft is through your defense platforms, but later in the game, you're able to unlock some carrier ships. Strike craft has units. That's the number of strike craft that can be launched at a time. And then next to it, it's how many replenish per day. So if it gets shot down mid-battle, that's how long it takes to get it back. And strike craft work a bit differently. Missiles fire at their target, and then once they hit their target, you need to send a new missile to deal more damage. Strike craft actually work as like little mini ships that run around and shoot at things. So each individual strike craft does this amount of damage. Engagement range is how far away the strike craft can go from the ship that spawned it. So that's a simple overview, but there's a lot more to the ship designer as you research tech. So I'm going to go ahead and use the research all tech console command. So there's a bunch of new ship classes that you can unlock over time. The first one that you'll unlock is frigates. This gives you a new slot type, a G slot. You can put in torpedoes or launchers. To start out with, you'll only have torpedoes unlocked. So let's start by talking about them. These are an explosive weapon, so they're kind of similar to missiles, but they do have some key differences. The first thing is that they deal a lot of damage. If we compare that to say regular nuclear missiles, this only deals 16 to 24 damage. This deals 100 to 150, though it does have a longer cooldown. The other major difference is that it has a really short range. So nuclear missiles are actually quite long range. They have 100 range, whereas torpedoes only have a range of 30. And then they have this new thing called firing arc. Most weapons are on a turret, and so they can shoot in any direction around the ship. Firing arc weapons means that the ship has to be pointed at its target. And then torpedoes deal multiplicative damage based on 20% of the target ship's size. So what this means is, for example, if this weapon is targeting a corvette with a ship size of 5, 20% of this ship size, so 5 times 0.2 or 1, is then multiplied onto the damage of the torpedo. So in the case of targeting a corvette, it's just going to deal this 100 to 150 damage. However, if we target something like a battleship with a ship size of 40, 40 times 0.2 is 8. So we get an 8 times damage bonus to a battleship. And in the early game, when you first unlock this, people aren't going to have battleships. But another big one is starbases. Starbases tend to have a pretty large ship size. You can't actually see this anywhere in the game, but But if we downgrade this starbase, the base level of the starbase is 20, and then each upgrade after that is an additional 20 ship size. So torpedoes are exceptionally good at dealing with starbases and other big ships. One of the downsides of torpedoes beyond just their short range and their firing arc is their slow speed. Regular missiles have 18, but this only has 9, which gives more time for point defense to shoot them down. So these weapons are very high risk, high reward. If you can manage to land a shot on a big target, you can do big damage, but the keyword there is if. And the other option for this G weapon slot is launchers. This gets the same multiplicative damage bonus to large ships like torpedoes do. Unlike torpedoes, which are an explosive type weapon and actually have a projectile that can be intercepted, this is like a blast of energy that doesn't have any way to shoot it down with point defense, and it has a much larger range than torpedoes. The main downsides are that it doesn't penetrate shields and instead has a minus 50% damage to shields, and it also has a minimum range of 45. So you want your protons launchers far away as kind of an artillery role, and you need other weapons to support it in order to knock out enemy shields. Destroyers are the first ship type that give you access to medium and large weapon slots. The way that these ship sections work is that you can either choose between fewer large weapons or more small weapons, and they usually have an exchange rate of 2. So for example, on this destroyer, we can choose between 1 medium weapon or 2 small weapons. And for example, on this cruiser, we can choose between 1 large weapon or 2 medium weapons. Larger weapon slots tend to deal more damage than the equivalent amount of smaller weapon slots. So for example, a medium red laser, ignoring the different bonuses we're getting, is 4.95. Or if we go for 2 small red lasers, our average damage is, ignoring these modifiers, only 4.65 instead of 9.5. So by upgrading this ship section to a larger weapon slot, we're getting an extra 0.3 damage on average. Another advantage of bigger weapons is that they typically have a larger range. So if we look at this, the small only has a range of 40, the medium has a range of 60, and the large has a range of 80. The downside to going for bigger weapons is that you're getting less tracking. You're also reducing the number of targets that you can shoot at. 2 small weapons can be both independently firing at 2 different ships. 1 medium weapon can only fire at 1 ship at a time. Also, larger weapons are more likely to have a minimum range. So then there's cruisers, which are the most versatile ship class. They also can give you more of these guided missile slots. So if you want basically a bigger version of the frigate, you can do that. They also give you access to hangar slots, or they can also just have regular weapon slots. And then there's battleships, which can have even more hangars than cruisers. And they also give you the option of spinal mount weapons. So this gives you the X-sized weapons, and these are super big, really powerful weapons that also have a firing arc kind of like torpedoes. They have a lot of range and damage. And then there's Titans, and they give you access to this Titan weapon slot, which gets you access to this perdition beam, which actually deals splash damage. All ships within 40 range of the target take 500 damage from this. So this is a super powerful weapon. You also get access to a special component slot, an aura, that can either buff all of your ships in the system or debuff all the enemies in the system. There's defensive platforms and ion cannons, which can be built in the defenses tab at your starbases. The main body of the starbase you cannot customize the design of. You can add different module slots like gun batteries, torpedo batteries, and hangar bays in order to increase the amount of weapon slots that your starbase has. There's also some buildings which add some auras to your system. For example, the disruption field generator, which reduces shield hit points for all hostile ships in the system. Standard starbases don't have any point defense slots, and as we talked about before, they're exceptionally vulnerable to things like torpedoes. So it'd be very wise to make a defense platform that at least has some point defense on it. Deep space citadels can be constructed with your construction ships with the build megastructure menu. They're basically like more powerful starbases that you can place anywhere in the system. And then there's also the Juggernaut. Juggernauts are cool because they work as a mobile shipyard. You can actually build ships from them. so it can be great to reinforce your fleet mid-campaign. And also, if the Juggernaut is stationary, it can repair your fleets if you go ahead and enter the orbit of it. So this can be great as a mobile repair station for your fleets, particularly if you're fighting something like a crisis, where in a normal conflict you can just occupy an enemy starbase and repair there. But if you're fighting a crisis, you might have big swaths of space where there are no starbases, and rather than having to wait for a construction ship to come out and build one for your fleet to repair, this can keep your fleets going even deep within enemy territory. Titans and Juggernauts are a bit different than normal ships because, for one, they both have limits to how many you can build independent of your naval capacity, and in order to build them you need a starbase at the Citadel tier, with a Titan assembly yards for Titan ships and a Colossal assembly yards for Juggernauts. Other things when it comes to ship designs is these components on the side over here. So you have your reactor, which determines how much power the ship has. There's the hyperdrive, and this reduces the amount of time it takes to travel between hyperlanes. And jump drives give you the option to initiate a jump, so you can basically teleport to anywhere within this circle. There's a small charge time of a couple of days, and then you appear at your destination. It's very powerful. It does have a bit of a cooldown, and during the cooldown, it reduces your weapon damage and sublight speed. Then there's your thrusters, and this increases the speed of your ship and also the evasion chance. Your sensors improve your sensor range, and they also increase the tracking of your ship. And this final component down here, your ship computer, gives you various bonuses, and it also affects the behavior of the ship. So for example, Swarm, your ship will get as close to the enemy as possible within short range, whereas something like Artillery, your ship will hang as far back using its long-range weapons. It's important to pick your ship computer depending on what kind of weapons you want to be using. Let's say, for example, you have a battleship with a lot of weapons that have a minimum range. Then picking a artillery combat computer will be good to make sure that they stay back. That way they can get the most use out of their range. Or for example, on like your frigate, you can pick a siege computer, which is good for getting up close and really getting use of your short range torpedoes. Or you can pick artillery if you're going to be using a longer range launcher. Then there's also this auxiliary component slot, which can do a wide variety of different things as you unlock research. For example, there's the reactor booster if you just want more power for other stuff. There's things like afterburners that increase your sublight speed and evasion chance. Some of these give you armor or shield hardening. Hardening is basically a counter to shield or armor penetration. There's a bunch of other weapons that I haven't talked about, but I don't want to go through every single number of how every single weapon works. You should be able to look at these stats and mostly understand what they do, what their role is. Let me talk about biological ships because they work a bit differently to regular ship sets. Most of their actual components are basically just a reflavored version of all of the mechanical ones. They have some slight balance tweaks, but say something like the Shard Accelerator or the Red Beam Projector are not that different from mass drivers or red lasers. Something like your Combat Mandibles is basically like a shorter range torpedo. The thing that makes biological ships that's different is that they have a different selection of ship classes. At the start of the game, you start with Maulers, which are kind of like frigates somewhat, in that they have these mandibles, which, like I said, work very similarly to torpedoes. They deal a lot of damage at a really close range. Think of this as kind of like literally biting other ships. And then you start with a second ship class unlocked, unlike mechanical, which only has the one. This is a Weaver, which is kind of like a support ship. So you can, in quotes, shoot your own ships with a buff, like extra evasion chance and sublight speed, or debuff the enemies with a reduced evasion chance and sublight speed. Another big difference is that they use food for a large portion of their cost instead of mostly only alloys. Once you research the tech, you can unlock 2 more ship classes, Harbinger, which is basically like a carrier ship, and Stinger, which is basically like a long-range artillery ship. They also have access to things like Titans and Juggernauts. The biggest difference is that these ships can actually evolve over time into more advanced versions of themselves. So there's 3 different tiers. There's juvenile, mature, and elder. And each of these sections is what those tiers are. So you don't get all of this whole window all at once. This section right here is what you get when it's a juvenile. This is what you get when it's mature. This is what you get when it's elder. So for example, by ranking up our Mauler from juvenile to mature, we get an additional small weapons slot and 2 extra utility defense slots. When you grow the ship to the next tier, it increases the naval capacity usage, but it does keep the same ship size. Once you research the tech for it, there's this slot down here, and you can add a growth gland to it, which will give it a growth progress rate. So over time, they'll make progress to growing up, and then they'll advance to the next tier. You can also just build them at a higher tier to start out with, though that does increase the cost. So overall, the growth glands are more resource efficient if you're willing to wait for it. So that's a basic overview of how biological ships work. So that's a whole bunch of information, but how do you actually apply this to making ship designs? I would say that there's 2 main approaches you can take to designing your ships. The first is to make a multi-role ship that can deal with a wide variety of different situations and doesn't have any major vulnerabilities. For example, make sure you have something like energy weapons that can deal damage to armor. Make sure your ships have some kinetic weapons that can deal with shields. Make sure that you have some of your own shields and that you have some of your own armor. This will allow you to be very flexible and deal with a wide variety of different threats. The other approach is to specialize your fleets to deal with specific enemies. For example, if you have a rival that you expect to end up at war with soon, make sure that you build a spy network on them, because if you're able to get over 60 intel, you can get medium military intel. This allows you to open up their ship details and see what their ship designs are. So for example, they're using lots of lasers and some missiles. They also have some frigates, which have more lasers and some torpedoes. So against this fleet, if we're making a design, we would want to be using lots of shields to counter their lasers, and we would want to be using some point defense to destroy their missiles. Also, they have slightly more armor than shields, so maybe we lean slightly heavier into energy weapons to deal with that. So if I was making a design at a relatively similar tech level, I might make something like this. We have some point defense, we have a good amount of energy weapons, but we do have something to deal with their shields as well. We have a lot more shields of our own, but still a little bit of armor, just to deal with the rogue missile that does make it through our point defense. Here's an alternative design that could possibly work that's a bit more extreme than the previous one. They didn't have any point defense, so our missiles would be quite effective against them. And also because they're relying entirely on missiles and energy weapons, the idea with this is that we're using our point defense to try and shoot down every single missile possible. And so we're going all shields to try and counter the energy weapons. And like we talked about before, because our shields are regenerating mid-battle, we can absorb a huge amount of damage from their laser weapons. So hopefully our ships will be extremely survivable, and we can whittle them down through attrition with our missiles. Maybe you swap one of these shields out with an armor just in case the occasional missile gets through. So you can kind of decide how much you specialize to deal with a specific threat. Do you go all in on one very particular strategy, which can be a bit risky, but if it works out, it could have some really crazy results? Or do you go for something a little bit more moderate, a ship that will still be mostly decent in other situations as well? Now, getting to this level of intel on another empire can be quite a bit of work. But you can also get a lot of information about your enemies by just watching battles and seeing what happens. This fleet combat menu, as well as the battle reports, can be very useful for seeing what kind of weapons they're using. They've dealt this amount of damage to our shields with medium UV lasers and with fusion missiles. And also, once the battle is over, this fleet combat stats menu can give you a bunch of information about them. And even if you lose a battle, it can give you a lot of valuable information. So maybe you start the war, things go terribly, your fleet gets mostly destroyed and wiped out. So when you're going to make a new one, learn from what happened and adapt. One of the downsides to specializing your ships this way is if something unexpected happens, it can really mess you up, particularly if you're using a fleet that relies heavily on one particular strategy. So the more multi-role fleet is going to be more flexible. Neither of these options are a wrong way to play the game. If you want to just make a standard ship design, you just use the same thing every single playthrough. It's just a generalist design and it counts for everything. That's nice if you don't want to think about it as much or you want to be very flexible with your grander strategy. Both are going to be better than the auto-generated designs. For example, look at this auto-generated design that it made. It is using nanite autocannons, which have a minus 75% damage to armor. So this ship would be awful if it ran into a fleet that's using a lot of armor. It's just looking at the average damage of this weapon and not really considering anything else. Another thing to think about as well is not just the individual ship design, but how those ships work together as a full fleet. How are different ships able to support each other in different roles? For example, we've talked quite a bit about point defense, but not every ship type is able to add point defense to it. And also that would severely limit your ability to actually bring your firepower to your fleet. So maybe you could build a specific destroyer design that has some point defense if you're going up against some strike craft, maybe also get a flak battery on here. So a ship like this can defend your other more vulnerable ships and of course fill out the rest of those component slots with whatever you need. Generally speaking, it's probably not a good idea to just make all one ship type and then just spam a single design. Smaller ship classes can stay relevant even later into the game. When you're thinking about your fleet composition and building your fleets, an important thing to consider is redundancy. So if you only bring, say, a single point defense destroyer or something like that, and it gets shot down, then your entire fleet loses point defense capabilities. So maybe make sure, if it's really important to your fleet, that several different ships have it, or you bring a few backups just in case it does get shot down. There's kind of like this concept of graceful degradation. So building your fleets with the idea that it's going to take damage and wear down over time. Can it still be functional even in spite of losses? I suppose there's one third approach to designing ships, which is also totally valid, and it's just going for vibes and whatever's the coolest and completely ignoring how effective it actually is in game. That is another completely fun way to play as well. So that's everything I wanted to cover in this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this is really helpful for you. I'd be really curious to know what your thoughts are. I try to read as many of the comments as I can, and I really appreciate the support. I did a bunch of research and testing for this video, but please do let me know if there's anything I missed or got wrong. And with that, goodbye.